Let's talk about the vexed problem of universals in Western philosophy. By universals, I mean the relationship of names to things, and of both of those to standard categories in the Western analysis of phenomena, like the individual, the species, the genus, and so on. This problem was explored and temporarily resolved in the Middle Ages thanks to a kind of dialectical triad. First of all, there was a realist thesis, which was very much favored by Christian theology, because realist philosophy, as understood then, was very convenient to the formulation of Christian doctrine. Then there arose, inevitably, as such things do, a nominalist antithesis, which seemed to challenge and at least to put into some question some of the favorite doctrines, some of the favorite explanations of Christian theology. And thirdly, Peter Abelard came along with a synthesis called conceptualism, which was an immediate success. It was accepted by thinkers for the next century and a half anyway, Thomas Aquinas and others who knew Aristotle, and who could have ignored Abelard's solution because it was in fact very like Aristotle's, nevertheless liked the way that Abelard presented the conceptualist response to the problem so much that it became a standard part of Western thought. The problem remained settled for little more than that century and a half, though. Since the 14th century, many thinkers, scientists and theologians, as well as philosophers, have tended to fall into either the realist, the nominalist, or the conceptualist camp on this set of issues. Let's try to break it down. Universals, the problem of universals, is a philosophical issue which questions the relationship between names and things, and between the various category in which we tend to classify names, things, and other phenomena, genera, species, individuals, and so on. This issue has arisen in practically every vital period of philosophical speculation. Its medieval expression, I think, reveals a great deal about both classical sources and modern permutations of this durable issue. Aristotle reached some conclusions about the relationship between names and things. Moderns who have done the history of philosophy and who discuss ancient philosophy tend to label his teaching on that score moderate realism. He's not an absolute realist, but he's not a nominalist either. He was, however, innocent of the conceptualist doctrine, which Peter Abelard developed to solve the problem. The pagan philosopher Porphyry, who was probably born about 233 CE and who died at some point after 301 CE, produced a summary discussion of Aristotle's complex logical teachings, which he named isagoge in Greek. This was basically a commentary on Aristotle's book of categories, the book of categories which the young Augustine had read and which he had not liked very much, by which he was not very impressed. But it remained a very widespread book. Porphyry himself was a very interesting guy. He was a pagan philosopher born in the city of Tyre in Phoenicia, who got interested in Christianity, but his interest turned out to be little more than a flirtation. He then got much more attracted by Judaism and tended towards a kind of highly philosophical Judaism, which must have disturbed some of the contemporary rabbis, although it certainly appealed to some of them, and it certainly served as an occasion for proselytism, for converting more and more people from the polytheistic world of the Mediterranean to Jewish belief. Now, Porphyry's isagoge survived the collapse of classical Mediterranean civilization better than any of Aristotle's own works on logic. They would remain unknown to Western thinkers until about the mid-12th century, roughly 1150, when they came back into the knowledge of West Europeans thanks to Latin translations. Latin translations, first of all, from Arabic translations of Aristotle's Greek, and then Latin translations directly from Aristotle's own Greek. Porphyry's isagoge, however, was standard reading for any student of logic in the early medieval West, from the 4th century until the mid-12th. In that work, Porphyry restated the problem of universals, but proposed no solution. As always with Porphyry, it's the flirtation that is interesting rather than the consummation of the intellectual relationship. The Christian philosopher Boethius, born in 480, dying in 523, too young, executed on the charge of treason by the Ostrogothic king of Italy, Boethius hoped to translate all the works of Plato and Aristotle into Latin and to resolve their differences, an enormous project that no one has ever come anywhere near achieving. He did succeed in translating the isagoge into Latin, and thus it became the standard textbook. I should say the standard textbook for Western European thinkers, not since the 4th century, but since the 6th, from the 520s, or perhaps the 510s, when Boethius was able to render it into his own language. Boethius, elsewhere in his writings, also left very tempting references to the universals question, but referring to it only. Now, Boethius had tremendous credibility tremendous prestige in medieval Western Christianity. He seemed to be kind of a martyr, and the book of his, which practically every medieval intellectual knew, was The Consolation of Philosophy. Boethius, imprisoned, is visited in a dream by Lady Philosophy, and they have a dialogue about justice, injustice, about providence, about fate, free will, all those great issues. We tend to look back on Augustine's Confessions as the great work of the late patristic age, of the end of antique Christian thought. But Augustine's Confessions would not really be discovered and injected into the mainstream of Western speculation until the 17th century. For the Middle Ages, it was Boethius' Consolation, and thanks to the tremendous prestige of the Consolation of Philosophy, references to the philosophical issue of the universals became standard in Western speculation. In the late 10th century, West European schools, especially in France for some reason, took up the question once more. In the second half of the 11th century, two schools of thought on the issue, the realist school and the nominalist school, presented themselves. Now, realist thinkers maintained that the names for things res, were adequate indicators of the things they designated. Thus, names were real signs of the things they denoted. A favorite explanatory phrase, not exactly a definition, for names was note rerum, notes of things. It's important to recognize that what the modern vernacular English language thinks realism means is not at all what realism meant in this particular discussion. If anything, the realists were the less realistic from the modern American point of view. One of the most outstanding realist thinkers was Lanfranc, born about 1010 in northern Italy and dying as Archbishop of Canterbury in the year 1089. Lanfranc was a North Italian who taught canon law, in the schools of Italy and of France, and eventually became the prior of the school at the Benedictine monastery of Bec in Normandy, and ended up as Archbishop of Canterbury. His career is quite striking, and has, I think, some relevance to the evolution of the issue as we've come to understand it. Lanfranc was an extremely successful teacher of canon law, was making a great deal of money doing that. He was, however, a cleric, and a very serious Christian cleric indeed. He was teaching at the Cathedral School of Avranches in western Normandy, just across the bay from the great monastery of Mont Saint-Michel. Avranches was a very distinguished school at the time, and Lanfranc was pupils flocked to him from all over Western Europe, to the extent that he got tired of it. He decided to leave the world. He was embarrassed by all the money he was making, and he went off to be a hermit. And he picked as a community to which he could attach himself as a hermit the new monastery of Bec in eastern Normandy, or actually in central Normandy, between what is traditionally called Upper Normandy and Lower Normandy. It had been founded in 1042 by a knight who left the world, and shortly after he had established his hermitage and some other people had come to join him, Lanfranc arrived, and the abbot said to Lanfranc, "You must lead our school." Now, Lanfranc hadn't wanted to do that, but he recognized that he had a duty to spread learning. Although his own learning had been in the field of law, Lanfranc became famous as a teacher of logic, and people soon came to Bec to study logic rather than law from this distinguished figure. Lanfranc's outstanding pupil was Anselm, born in 1033, dying in 1109, another North Italian who traveled to France to study logic. He seems to have gone to school at Pavia in Italy, and then he went to eastern central France to study logic, and then made his way to Avranches because he heard that Lanfranc was there. When Lanfranc left Avranches, Anselm followed him after a while to the Abbey of Bec. When Lanfranc left the directorship of the school at Bec to become an abbot of a local Norman monastery, then Anselm took over for him as head of the school, and then he became abbot of Bec, and finally Archbishop of Canterbury. In other words, he followed his master Lanfranc in all of his positions in life. He also followed him in his logical teaching, and he took the realist school a great deal further than anyone else had. Anselm, for example, developed the remarkable argument of the ontological proof of the existence of God. The argument that once you properly define God, once you understand what the name God means, then if you really explore this definition of which you are fully cognizant, of which you're fully conscious, then you have demonstrated to yourself that God exists. I won't go into that proof right now. It's had its own remarkable kind of history. But it's an example of the value of realist thinking and logic to Christian theology. Never before had there been a proof quite like that. Later proofs of the existence of God by Thomas Aquinas, for example, have proven not to be nearly as compelling as Lanfranc's ontological argument, which is taught today with fascination by numerous professors of philosophy in American universities, themselves agnostic or irreligious, who nevertheless maintain that you cannot disprove Anselm's ontological argument. So realism was a powerful ally of Christian theology. Nominalist thinkers maintained, on the contrary, that names are nomina, which gives its name to their school. Names have little or no reality content. Some names may convey adequate information about the things they commonly designate, but that connection was at best accidental and never reliable. Instead, names are really conventional signs with little relationship to the things they designate. Some nominalists went so far as to say that names were merely eruptions of sound. Flatus vocis was their favorite expression. And flatus vocis is quite a remarkable term. One gropes for a polite way of translating it. It refers to a kind of vocal flatulence. When one of the great nominalists proposed this particular formula, he knew very well that he was appealing to a kind of earthy rejection of the whole position he was attacking. According to the nominalist, anything could be called by any name, even by names conventionally supposed to designate the opposite, without affecting the reality of the thing in question. An important early nominalist was a man named Berengar of Tours, a cleric, maybe born about 1000, who died about 1088, quite a long life. Berengar got into a famous argument with Lanfranc about what happened when a priest consecrated bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. That is, the central Christian mystery of the Eucharist. In the course of the dispute, Lanfranc accused Berengar of wishing to understand everything by reason, rejecting thereby sacred authority. It's important to recognize that Berengar was not denying the transformation of the ordinary bread and wine into the mystical body and blood of Christ. He was entirely agreeing that what the priest said made it happen, but he questioned how what the priest said could possibly do that. The formula, which was very dear to realist explainers of sacramental theology, was this. The priest is supposed to say, "This is my body," the priest acting as Christ, not as priest. And the phrase there is, "Hoc est corpus meum," this hoc is my corpus. Now here we're talking about a name which is not even a noun, it's a pronoun, the word hoc. But it stands for a noun, this piece of bread, in other words. And what realists asserted was that once God heard the priest acting in his stead say, "Hoc, this," he understood that he was referring to a piece of bread. And when the priest went on to say, "This is my body," then the bread, became the body. Interesting kind of grammatical extension of realism. A vulnerable one, as Berengar recognized, and Berengar went to work upon it. He was pretty much rejected, although he continued to have a successful career within the church. He was never accused of any kind of heresy or anything of that sort, but he was seen as a dangerous man, proposing a dangerous doctrine with potentially serious consequences for the stability of Christian belief. The next generation of nominalism was very well represented by one Roscelin of Compiègne, born in 1050 and dying in 1125, who said that one could describe the Christian Trinity as consisting of three gods rather than of three persons in one God, as the ancient formula of the Council of Nicaea had defined the doctrine of the Trinity. It didn't really matter what you said, since the words God and person were merely flatus vocis without any real meaning. Anselm, Lanfranc's pupil, accused Roscelin of tritheism, a heretical doctrine which argued that God was actually three gods. But a church council in 1092 understood Roscelin's argument well enough to clear him of the charge. And once he was cleared of the charge of heresy, he was immediately offered appointment to cathedral chapters all throughout Europe, all the way from England to the German Empire. And he accepted lots of them and would visit these chapters from time to time. He settled down in the city of Loches in Anjou, where he taught many people, including Peter Abelard. Now again, with both Berengar and and Roscelin. It's very important to understand that we have here an interesting kind of discussion with potential consequences of a heretical character. Neither Roscelin nor Berengar denied the belief in the Eucharist, the belief in the Trinity, two of the most central and incomprehensible mysteries of formal Christian theology. Nor did they reject the formula by which these things were explained. Berengar did not reject the formula hoc est corpus meum, nor did Lanfranc reject the formula of the Council of Nicaea. Instead, what both Berengar and Lanfranc tackled was what these formulae meant. How could the priest saying hoc est corpus meum achieve what the priest achieved, which he believed that he did achieve by saying that phrase? How can we understand the Trinity, this coexistence of three persons in one God, since neither the term person nor the term God conveys very much in the way of useful logical thought? So we have here a dispute which was impossible in early centuries of medieval thought, a dispute which required a certain mental level, if you want, a certain level of education in which people were willing to debate issues in these strictly, coldly logical terms. The nominalist-realist debate died down after 1125 thanks to the theory of conceptualism developed by Peter Abelard, born in 1079 and dying in 1143. Abelard's a fascinating man. He was born in Brittany, the son of a noble family, distantly related to the Duke of Brittany. Although he was the eldest son, he resigned his primogeniture right to inheriting his father's fief, and he went off to study philosophy, exchanging, as he said, the arms of Mars for the arms of Minerva, the goddess of wisdom. He studied with Roscelin at Loches, and then he went on to Paris to study with a pupil of Anselm's, and defeating both of his teachers in debate within the classroom, as he tells, reducing them to humiliation, according to himself, to his own account of these things. He then moved on to develop his own synthetic doctrine of conceptualism. William of Champeaux was the Paris teacher, the teacher in the Paris Cathedral School, who was a student of Anselm of Beck's, a very loyal realist disciple of his. Abelard disagreed with him in public debate, and according to Abelard, this caused William to retire from the Cathedral School of Paris and to go off to found a monastery and eventually become a bishop, since he was no longer capable of upholding his logical position. Abelard said that there were three key questions in this dispute, three key questions which, if properly answered, would cut through to the heart of the matter. First question is, whether names or things, and, for that matter, species and genera, exist intramentally or extramentally as well. That is, do they exist only in the mind intramentally or outside the mind as well? The second question is, if they exist in reality extramentally, are they material or immaterial? And the third question is, if one, they are real, and two, whether they are material or immaterial, are they separate from things or involved in them? For Abelard, the names we give to species, such as man, and genera, such as animal, were the key names in the issue. Man is a species of the genus rational animal, or is a rational species of the genus animal, I should say, and individual men were given names like Plato and Aristotle. And they would ask questions like, if Socrates is in Athens and Plato is in Rome and Aristotle is in Paris, then where is man? Where is humanity? If the individuals are in different places, where does the species reside? This was a favorite question of realists, of nominalists, and Abelard tackled it in his turn. Abelard, before giving his solution, then asked three new questions. First of all, what is there in things which enables us to give them common names, because we certainly do that. If, in fact, there are no such things as universals, then what do common names designate? Abelard is starting to talk linguistics, semantics, if you want, as well as logic in a narrow sense. Thirdly, Abelard's third question, if particular things should cease to exist, would their names still designate the content or notion to us? In other words, he asked, if all the roses were to die, what would the name Rose mean? Now, this is typical, I think, of Abelard's remarkable genius, his remarkable capacity for finding the perfect instance, the perfect formulation of his thought. Think of roses. Roses are red, pink, white, to put it just simply to begin. Roses can be very simple, 4 petals turned out in the wild variety, or very complicated hybrid roses. Roses are a wonderfully diverse kind of species with a great range of subspecies as well as individuals. So it's much more striking, I think, and much more intelligent for Abelard to ask this question about roses. This question, by the way, if all the roses were to die, what then would the name Rose mean, lets us know that Shakespeare, or at any rate Romeo, was a nominalist, right? Or rather, Juliet was a nominalist. By Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? By any other name, you would be the same to me. But because of your name, we cannot get together. A good example of the folly of realism and the wisdom, the romantic wisdom of nominalist thought, which is pretty much the way Shakespeare's 16th century tended to think about these things. What Abelard concluded was that logically defined names are adequate concepts, adequate to the thing of which they serve as a sign, adequate to the demands of systematic logical consistency. Names are not different from things in an absolute radical way. They are just differently conceived aspects of things, the mental aspect of things, if you wish, and intramental as well. As Abelard put it, the crucial distinction is a distinction non aliud sed aliter. The name is not something else, it is somehow differently existing. Abelard's conceptualism was actually quite close to Aristotle's moderate realism, of which Abelard was unaware. His conceptualism would be accepted by Thomas Aquinas and still has its defenders today. Now, I think it's useful to ask how Abelard was able to reach the level of Aristotelian speculation on this matter without knowing Aristotle's full logical work, knowing only the Isagoge of Porphyry, which, as we mentioned, simply poses the question without offering any kind of resolution. And this, I think, is a tremendous indication of the sophistication of Western thought in medieval Europe, even before its classical sources were fully known to it. The fact that someone like Abelard could deal with a logical issue, knowing that the master of logic was Aristotle, knowing that there were many, many works of Aristotle, they knew the titles of these books, of which they did not have copies, and yet could go ahead instead of simply waiting to get a copy of the relevant book, is a sign of the independence as well as the sophistication of Western thought at that time. Abelard, of course, was himself immensely bumptious. I mentioned already the way in which he went about from teacher to teacher, almost like a knight going about from tournament to tournament, looking for someone with whom he could debate, looking first of all for someone from whom he could learn, but with whom he could then fight and overthrow in fair combat. He liked to present things that way. Although he had turned in the arms of Mars for the arms of Minerva, he maintained the mentality of a young gentleman of the highly combative feudal aristocracy, which had trained him and obviously conditioned him. He also got into serious trouble with the authorities of the church. For example, his work in the Trinity, his effort to explain the Trinity better than either Anselm or Roscelin had been able to do so, was condemned by 2 church councils. Although now, as we read it, we find it very difficult to figure out what the problem was. Abelard's effort to explain such profound and central mysteries as the Trinity deeply shocked the respectable leaders of church opinion in his time. For example, Bernard of Clairvaux, who was kind of the public voice of his moment, a figure who had a kind of credibility in the world of serious letters that would later be enjoyed by Erasmus, and then in the 18th century by Voltaire. Bernard of Clairvaux, who belongs to the old sort of rabbinical Augustinian tradition of thought about sacred topics, was horrified by what Abelard was doing, even more than by what Abelard was saying. What Abelard basically was doing was using logic, Aristotelian-style logic, to explain Christian doctrine. To people like Bernard, this raised the old question, the old specter of Athens taking over Jerusalem. One of the early fathers of the church had asked, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? And one of the great efforts of Christian thinking has been to combine the tradition of Greek rationality with the revelation of the Hebrews. And that is a very unstable blend, to be sure, and from time to time it threatens to explode and to disappear. In Bernard's mind, Abelard was bringing the mixture to a very dangerous level of temperature, a very dangerous level of heat in the laboratory of logical speculation, and his efforts should be stopped. But even Bernard was not able to convince the fathers of the 12th century French church that Abelard's teaching was heretical. Abelard's whole approach was heretical. But the teaching survived. It was accepted by standard scholastic theologians, by Thomas Aquinas, for example, and incorporated into Thomas's own logical works. That's interesting, because Thomas was a deep Aristotelian. Thomas might perfectly well have dismissed what Abelard's efforts had tried to establish and simply gone straight back to Aristotle, since Abelard's conceptualism and Aristotle's moderate realism were very close. Why didn't he do that? He didn't do it because Abelard's formulation of the conceptualist solution to the problem of universals was so elegant, was so usefully stated, that Thomas found it an important thing to maintain. This was true, actually, with lots of Abelard's doctrines, Abelard's ethics, which were also like the ethics of the Platonists, the Aristotelians, and indeed the New Testament, and which were very different from the kind of legalistic ethics of the previous 1,000 years of medieval thought, or the previous 500 years of medieval thought. However, the conceptualist solution to the problem of universals adopted by Aquinas and the other scholastics did not last. Nominalism revived in the 14th century, indeed in the late 13th century, and this revival began in England. One of the most important of the early nominalists is a Franciscan scholastic named Duns Scotus, who is a professor in the English universities and a deeply devout Franciscan figure, certainly not trying to challenge any statement of Christian doctrine. The most flamboyant supporter of nominalism in the 14th century was another Briton, an Englishman named William of Ockham, who was born in the south of England in Surrey, probably about the year 1290, and who died in either 1349 or 1350 as a victim of the Black Death, of the terrible bubonic plague which had come out of India and was ravaging European cities and European communities, particularly clusters of clerics gathered together with terrific effectiveness. Now, William of Ockham was a very radical man. He liked radical stances. He was a radical Franciscan friar who got condemned as a heretic by the papacy, and immediately, therefore, supported by the Holy Roman Emperor, and who had to escape from papal territory with the aid of an imperial agent, a very exciting kind of story, almost like modern spy narratives. What William of Ockham got condemned by the papacy for was his attack upon church property, not anything nominalist or realist or theological or philosophical in the proper sense. On the other hand, he did use many of his nominalist arguments to argue that the connection between text in the Bible and present conditions were invalid. The papacy was trying to claim that Christ was himself the CEO of a land-owning corporation, and Peter, as his successor, was simply continuing the same thing, and certain texts would be adduced from the New Testament. Occam made wild fun of these texts, not on the grounds of historical linguistics, but on the grounds of nominalist analysis of terms. And this was delicious to hear to people who were opposed to church property, like most secular rulers who would like to own a good deal of that property the church then had. They were certainly not opposed to property. And so the Emperor Henry, the Emperor Louis of Bavaria, supported Occam in his tiff with the Pope. In time, this kind of nominalism led to far more serious consequences. Widely taught in the faculties of letters of the universities of Oxford and Cambridge and then on the continent, it led to the conviction that no theological truth can be demonstrated by reason. Faith alone is adequate to establishing religious certitude. And right there you have, of course, the fundamental theological statement of Martin Luther, who, like most university intellectuals of his generation, was a nominalist. And that nominalism strongly affected his theology and the later history of Western Christianity. Galileo, otherwise a radical reconceiver of the universe, seems, surprisingly enough, to have been a realist in philosophical matters. The great 17th and 18th century thinkers John Locke and Immanuel Kant were conceptualists, although I don't think they would have described themselves that way. More probably they would have said that Aristotle's moderate realism convinced them. And later on, David Hume, the great 18th century logician, George Berkeley, and Quine have certainly been nominalists in our own day. So this great issue lives on, quaint and obscure as its medieval discussion sometimes appears to us.